Hi, welcome back. We're up to Lecture 6, Segment 2. And this lecture is all about measurement issues. In the first segment, we talked about reliability. In the second segment, we're going to talk about validity. So there's a lot to talk about when talking about the validity of a construct. First of all, we have to talk about what is a construct, how do we operationalize it, that sounds like a mouthful, and then there are a lot of ways to assess validity. And I'll walk you through each one of these just with one quick example. There are actually entire courses on measurement theory that cover reliability and validity. So to cover all of this in just one lecture is a bit difficult, but again, I think it's critical to expose you to these issues in an introductory statistics course. So what is a construct? Again, I'm coming at statistics from the social sciences rather than, say, like from mathematics, where they would worry less about issues like this. A construct, simple way to define it, is it's an ideal object that's not directly observable as opposed to real objects. So remember back when I talked about variables and constants, it's like comparing apples and gravity. Apples are real objects. We can measure the size, the weight, the type, and so on. They're very easy to measure. We don't need a construct, an abstract construct of apple. But in the social sciences, we do deal with very fuzzy and abstract constructs all the time. Perhaps the most famous one is intelligence. For over 100 years, researchers have been arguing about what intelligence really means. How should we really assess it? That construct, intelligence, is one of the most famous and one of the most controversial. But that's a construct. The personality traits are also a construct. One of the most important things for statistics and to do empirical research is to operationalize a construct. So first define the construct, but then come up with some way to quantify that construct. So that's the process of operationalization. How do we operationalize a construct? You define it to make it observable and quantifiable. So for example, intelligence tests. So we have this idea that there's something called intelligence, and that came out of observations of children in classrooms. Some tended to do better across the board than others. And then intelligence tests were developed to operationalize that construct intelligence. And again, there's a lot of controversy around how that's done, but that's the process of defining a construct and then operationalizing it. So then we can do empirical research, we can get data and do our statistics. So how do we evaluate the validity of a construct? Turns out there are sort of four main categories to look at when you're looking at construct validity. First is content validity, then the next two sort of go hand in hand, convergent and divergent validity, and then finally, nomological validity. So to illustrate those four types of validity, I'm going to take a very simple example that's not very controversial. We'll move away from the intelligence tests, but related. Let's look at verbal ability in young children. This is a construct. It's a very important construct for academic achievement. As you're raising your children, you want them to learn how to read. You want them to build their vocabulary. This leads to their verbal ability, a construct that cognitive psychologists and educational psychologists and developmental psychologists use quite often. So there's our construct, verbal ability. How might we operationalize that? Well, one way is just to develop a vocabulary test. We could come up with a vocabulary test, administer it to a bunch of children, and see how they do. Does it assess their verbal ability in a valid way? Well, how will we determine if it's valid? Well, first, look at content validity. Content validity is very simple. It's just face validity. Look at the test. Does this look like it's a vocabulary test that's appropriate for this population, this sample of children? So is it a collection of words that these children should know, some of them, not all of them, right? We wouldn't give a vocabulary test in German to students in Brazil, right? That wouldn't have content validity. And we wouldn't give a vocabulary test that's appropriate for, say, 12-year-old children to 4-year-old children, because they wouldn't get any of them right, most likely. So that would be lacking in just face validity or content validity. So that's a real simple one. The next two go hand in hand, convergent and divergent validity. So the idea of convergent validity is scores on this test, however I've operationalized the construct, this vocabulary test, scores on the vocabulary test should correlate well with other established measures of the same construct. So for example, if we have a measure of reading comprehension that we know is reliable and valid and well accepted by educators, teachers, parents, and then we administer our new vocabulary tests, and scores on the vocabulary test are correlated with scores on the reading comprehension test, then that indicates to us some level of convergent validity. The scores are converging on other measures of this construct, verbal ability. But it's not enough to have just convergent validity. And sadly, a lot of researchers just stop there. They try to get their convergent validity and then they stop. What's critical is to show the flip side. You got to have divergent validity along with your convergent validity. So you also have to show that your measure of verbal ability, say your vocabulary test, you also have to show that it correlates less well with some other ability, or correlates less well with things that it just shouldn't correlate with, say height, right? If there's any assessment that you can look at that it should be correlated at 0 with, then you should test that, and that would give you some evidence for divergent validity. So if you see a stronger correlation between the vocabulary test and reading comprehension than you do between the vocabulary test and some measure of spatial ability, for example, that would illustrate some divergent validity. So it's correlating with the things it should and not correlating with the things that it shouldn't. Convergent validity and divergent validity. Finally, there's nomological validity, which is more like a meta validity, if you will. The scores on the test, say this vocabulary test, they should be consistent with more general theories that exist in related fields of research. So for example, if we're looking at verbal ability in children, then scores on the test should be consistent with what we know about developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, and neuroscience. For example, a child with neural damage or disease to a particular brain region that is known to be important for the development of verbal ability, those children should score less well on this test of vocabulary if it is indeed a valid measure of that construct. That fits in with broader theories, and it's consistent with convergent evidence. So it fits with nomological concepts or theories, and that's why it's called nomological validity, sort of a broader approach to validity. Again, which sadly in the realm of social sciences is not addressed enough, in my opinion. So I want to sum up the first two segments here, reliability and validity, because they go hand in hand. And as I said, there are actually entire courses devoted to measurement theory. When I was a graduate student, I took an entire semester course just on measurement and reliability and validity. It's very common in cognitive psychology. It's even more common in developmental psychology and particularly educational psychology. It's really important to know that you have reliable and valid measurements and valid constructs. So the important things to take away are this broad theory, classical test theory or true score theory, then the different ways to get reliability estimates, and then the different ways to assess validity of a construct.